It's everywhere. There's talk of money needing to fund programs and to address a lack thereof. There's talk of infrastructure in some communities in Canada. You don't have drinkable water, so you have communities that don't have adequate roads. Some of the basic issues face communities. You have talk of relationships with police, issues around drugs, issues around gambling, family, and individual. So these are how Indigenous peoples in Canada actually talk about life and what they prioritize. With respect to the issues that are prevalent, elders are centered to how Indigenous peoples value their community. There's talk of language revitalization. Identity is important, as is racism. Racism is something that's relatively prevalent in Canada. There's suicide, that is a real issue that is facing community. There's violence, whether it be structural violence, whether it be lateral violence, whether it be actually physical violence taking place. You have a reclamation of traditions that are taking place. You have the influence of the church, and sometimes the traditionalists and the followers of the church are at odds with one another. You have substance abuse, that is an issue, and you still have challenging issues with respect to family and how to bring family about. So you might be wondering how this is all related. This is part of the objective of my presentation here. At first it appears as though these are two separate worlds that I'm talking about. But it's these two separate worlds that the researcher, the gambling researcher, must confront when they're actually doing the research, or they must be aware of the existence of that other world if they want to do an effective job in what they're doing. So I use this example here to demonstrate what I'm talking about. And as a gambling researcher, quite often what looks more intriguing is that what you see on the left, which is the entry point to the casino. You see a lot of Indigenous symbolism. In this particular instance, the front has a lot of meaning. The place of Rama is known as Majikinin in the local Indigenous language. It means the place of the fence, and it references historic fish weirs that are present at the nearby Lake Couchiching, the narrows between Lake Couchiching and Lake Simcoe. Indigenous peoples use this weir system to collect fish, and this is how the name of the place became significant. So it now adorns the entry point of the casino itself. It's difficult to see the other imagery, but you also have the clan imagery of the Anishinaabe that adorns the outside of the casino. You have a lot of colors, you have a lot of patterns. The hotel itself is something equivalent to how this Marais building is shaped. It's elongated. It's supposed to represent a ceremonial dwelling, a Dewan lodge. So there's a lot of symbolism and intriguing aspects to this gambling research that is prevalent in that image itself. If you look to the right, one of the implications of the casino development in the community is more infrastructure capital to develop in the community. So when the casino opened, you had roads that were built. You had a better water system that was implemented. You had a better sewage system that was implemented, all of course to help with the casino project itself. But you also had an elders residence being developed. You had a new school being developed. You had a new hockey arena that was built. And this is an image of the outdoor part this is an exterior image of the hockey arena itself, which houses a public library. But most importantly, it became the social space for the community. And within the community itself, the way community engaged with the arrival of the casino was separating social worlds. So you have people who may or may not attend the building on the left, which is the casino. You have some who perhaps go there too much and have a gambling addiction as a result of that. But you have other members of the community who explicitly avoid the casino because of their disagreement with how the arrangement all came about, or they may feel that gambling doesn't have a place in their lives, or they may feel indifferent towards the people who arrive at their community by the busloads every day as this continuous 24-hour cycle that is taking place. So the community members have actually coped or adapted how they live in their community by isolating that building, that massive structure that is actually at the center of their community itself. And because you have this new traffic coming into the community, because you have this new economic engine in the community, there's a need to recover or reclaim a space. And this building on the right became that space. It became like the community center zone, where traditional practices would be shared, in some cases revitalized. You had languages being revitalized within this building itself. You had stories being told. You had people generating a sense of identity and community. And just down the road, which is about a kilometer down the road itself, you had this massive entity taking place. So there were two worlds that people were living in. And it's something that doesn't always come apparent. If you're a gambling researcher coming into the community, you don't understand necessarily the logics of how people are operating at the community level. And I think that in order to do effective gambling research from an Indigenous perspective, you need to be aware of the total picture of what's going on in the community. So what does that mean? So I'm not here to talk about Western approaches to gambling research, because that's something that you've heard about thus far today, and you'll hear more a bit about that, or you've read about that. So I'm not here to tell you more about that, but I'm here to talk about how understanding the context in which First Nations communities and Indigenous communities operate, we can become better informed as researchers on how to approach the work that we do. So then, as I started off by mentioning that there's these two spaces that Indigenous peoples occupy, and those who center their position in the West occupy. And the Western position is a dominant position. It's the face of the university, it's the face of the academic, it's the face of major research funds that are driving the project itself. And sometimes you have Indigenous peoples who are just brought in for the sake of meeting the expectation that Indigenous perspectives are being integrated. So how do you approach this, or how do you try to achieve a resolve of this tension or this separation? It's not even a tension, because it's an actual separation that exists, and it's an acknowledgement that I'm just acknowledging that it exists. So there's a need then to bridge these dualities, to actually practice two-wide seeing. And I think when researchers from the dominant perspective engage in research, they're not actually competent in knowing how to do that, because they come from a different worldview, and they've naturalized that perspective on things, and they actually don't understand what Indigenous peoples are doing on the ground or their life experience. So we need then to reframe how we do gambling research by integrating the strengths of the West and that in which Indigenous peoples can bring to the table. So what are the implications? So by way of concluding, I'm just going to talk about what the implications are. So I'm not here to say that Western approaches to gambling research are inefficient or defective in any way, but I'm actually here to propose that we can improve research outcomes. So what are the implications then? One, and this is just by way of generating a conversation or a new way of thinking. So in terms of culture, we may be able to ask, what is an Indigenous model of problem gambling? Is it identical to the biomedical model of problem gambling? Or is there actually cultural perspectives that are involved in problem gambling itself? And is there variation? It's likely that there is variation, but how do we begin to understand how the Indigenous gambler engages in what we determine to be problem gambling, and how can we better understand that? We need to engage more in holistic research. For instance, the social determinist model may help inform that. Quite often when I read gambling literature, it's heavily influenced by the biomedical model, isolates the individual outside of the context outside of the context of their society, also outside of the context of colonization specific to Indigenous peoples themselves. We also need to situate history in the research that we do, and even the representation. Quite often, Indigenous gambling research may or may not begin with the Indigenous practice of gambling itself, and then it fast forwards to 1970 when the Indigenous groups, and I'm talking about a North American perspective here, when these political processes began. And so it's almost as though Indigenous peoples have no history at all in their engagement with gambling, and it just arrives all of a sudden in 1970. We also need to understand the economic context in which gambling takes place, and understand how that may impact communities in a different kind of way. So it's almost a cost-benefit approach, where you do not isolate the gambling itself without understanding the context. And we need we need more research that incorporates Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledge, because we need to build capacity in Indigenous communities. And if we build capacity in Indigenous communities, and we can allow for Indigenous peoples to participate in resolving the problems that they're faced with or the challenges. So that's all I have to share with you. Is there any questions?